Here we are, another pleasant morning, three of the cares of the universe. What I'd like to look at today is the concept of private investment. Because in a private investment for private profit world, we are constantly told that we need private investors to come in and provide the capital to build infrastructure, to provide services. And what we've seen over the last 40 years during the deregulation, privatisation, globalisation, corporatisation revolution that has swept over the planet, what we've seen is the rise of the power of corporations because of their ability to provide private investment to governments in order to create essential services and infrastructure. So why this fetish for private investment, especially in a country which is as rich as Australia, where the population is minuscule compared to the rest of the world? When you think of 25 million people living on a continent which is resource rich, which provides food to significant parts of the world through its agricultural initiatives, you begin to wonder why we are so dependent on private investment and why so much essential infrastructure is never built, and more importantly, why are the resources that we own as a people, especially the resources in the ground, why do they continue to be exploited by transnational corporations whose profits, to a significant degree, go overseas to company headquarters somewhere else on the planet? Why do these corporations continue to beg and scream that they can't pay taxes? They have difficulty paying royalties, that they cannot provide the necessary resources. Now, this is nothing radical. This is a simple equation. If you have resources and you give those resources to somebody else to develop so they can make a profit for their major shareholders, there is a third tier in the process. Now, if these resources belong to the Australian people through their sovereign ownership, through their governments at state and federal level, why do we continue to give over these resources to the private sector to develop, hoping we'll obtain some benefit from taxation and royalties? The fact is that only about 2% of the Australian population is involved in the resource extraction industry in this country. The fact is that a significant proportion of the profits that are made in this country come from that area. And the fact is that most of these profits are repatriated overseas because governments at their own risk face a concerted effort by these corporations to not pay profits. Now, we've seen after 40 years of deregulation, privatisation, globalisation, corporatisation, that the Andrews-led Labor government in Victoria, in a desperate bid to bolster its election prospects, talk about creating a new state electricity commission, which is publicly owned, which creates energy from renewable sources. Win-win situation. Publicly owned, renewable energy decrease greenhouse emissions. Why is it over the last 40 years we have pursued this privatisation bandwagon? And those of you who think that the Andrews-led Labor government has changed its tune, think again. Since it's been in office, it has privatised Melbourne ports, the Melbourne Port. It has privatised the Vic roads. It has privatised the Titles Office. And most importantly of all, it is privatising and continues to privatise the public housing sector. So we continue to have major issues regarding housing affordability in this state. So why do we need to add a third tier? Why does the private investment for private profit crowd need to dominate the political, social, cultural agenda in this country? When we could set up a resources future fund with the profits that can be made by governments creating, that's right, like the private sector does, creating money. I know it sounds a bit ridiculous, but obviously money is just a term of exchange. And that term of exchange is relevant if the particular institution which creates that form of exchange is actually able to back that mechanism of exchange. And as we have so many resources in this country, both human and natural, there is no question that we cannot back the creation of resources which are publicly owned. And there's no question that every resource which is owned by a corporation which is privately owned today is there because they believe they can make a profit. Now, unfortunately, this ideology, it is nothing more than an ideology. It is not something which is chiselled in stone. It's an ideology that has taken over the world today. This ideology is entrenched in every aspect of our existence. There is nothing wrong with us providing the capital to develop resources and use those profits that are made to reinvest in both human beings and the country. I mean, it's ridiculous in 2022 in a country as rich as Australia that we have 1/3 of the population living close or below the poverty line on social security benefits. It's ridiculous that we have issues regarding housing affordability, access to energy, access to healthcare. It's totally ridiculous and unneeded. And when we see the privatisation of almost every aspect of our existence, whether it's aged care, whether it's early childhood development, whether it's food production, food distribution, whether it's mineral resources, you begin to understand how important it is to change this ideology, which is accepted by 99.999% of the population in this country, who continue to think that a private investment for private profit ideology is the way for us to get ahead. I mean, a simple analogy is like this. If you've got access, say, to a patch of cabbages, and you hire somebody to grow those cabbages, and then you hire somebody to cut those cabbages, and then you hire somebody to transport those cabbages, and then you buy those cabbages, there's all these levels, and in a private investment for private profit world, each level has to make a profit in order to exist. Now, if as a society we grew the cabbages, harvested the cabbages, distributed the cabbages, you would cut out all these middle men, all these middle women, all these people who are making a profit from providing a basic human need. Today, in 2022, and the National Disability Insurance Scheme is a classical example, we have a mechanism where we try to provide basic resources for people with disabilities. But these resources are provided by the private sector. And we see huge issues regarding affordability, and 40 to 50% of every dollar which is given by the taxpayer, you and me, to provide these services goes to the private sector in terms of administration and profit. We have the ridiculous situation where in the aged care sector, poorly paid aged care workers have a wage rise, but that wage rise is paid by the taxpayer. We had the ridiculous situation where $350 million was allocated to the private aged care sector in order to provide food to its residents. So we have this private investment for private profit mantra entrenched in our DNA in this country. We have people, and a significant portion of the population, people like me, we're just an insignificant, marginalised minority, who think that the way forward is to corporatise the country, leave it in the hands of the private sector, allow them to make profits at our expense, and then hopefully provide some services for the creation of that profit. So what we are looking at is an ideological problem. We are not looking at an economic problem. We are not looking at a problem due to lack of resources. We are not looking at a problem due to the lack of human capital and an educated population. We are looking at a problem which is ideological. It has nothing to do with reality, especially in this country. And around the world, to a significant degree, we see the same problem. But the difference between Australia and the rest of the world, we have the human capacity and the natural resource capacity to actually address this issue. And we are not going to address these basic issues irrespective of changes of government, irrespective of election results, irrespective, of a media which is dominated by the private investment for private profit mantra. Irrespective of all this, the reality is that finite resources, increasing population growth, an economic system dominated by the private investment of a private profit model, and increasing CO2 emissions leading to a real climate emergency which has been made by human beings and the type of productive processes that we've used over the last 2 or 3 centuries. The fact is that whether we like it or not, we are going to need to change this ideological position. An ideological position which has been created to maximise profits for private corporations, private companies and individuals. It's ludicrous for these incredibly wealthy corporations and individuals to talk about philanthropy and providing charity to people. We don't need to talk about philanthropy. We need to talk about them paying their fair of taxes. We need to stop them dominating the political, social and cultural agenda. We need to stop them pulling the parliamentary strings. But currently, it seems almost impossible to break this nexus between private investment and private profit. Because we all think we are individuals and our role is to acquire resources and acquire property in order to survive. And in many regards, the more disposable income you have in a capitalist society, the more options you have. I mean, a child who's born in a capitalist society, like a child who's born to a king or queen, their future, to a significant degree, is decided at their birth. Where they're born, who their parents are, what the postcode is of where they're born, their educational opportunities. And unfortunately, we have allowed the private investment for private profit mantra to entrench exploitation, not disadvantage, exploitation, to entrench inequality, to entrench poverty, to entrench us in a cycle where we spend most of our time trying to acquire resources to keep a roof over our head, whether it's through rent or for mortgage repayments, to entrench an ideology that we need to compete against each other, not cooperate, to resolve these issues. And I say, and I continue to say, that the 21st century is an anarchist century. Anarchism is a political philosophy based on creating a society without rulers. Inequalities in power and wealth, it's what gives rulers, whether they're elected, whether they're self-appointed, whether they're corporate entities, the ability to determine the lives and fate of billions of people. And it's that struggle, the struggle to devolve power, that's share power, and the struggle to hold wealth in common and actually invest in our own future as a people, not through private corporations, but through the state or other entities, so that we can publicly own these resources, which then can be used for our own welfare. Now, one country that has been very successful in doing this is Norway. They've put their oil reserves in a future fund. Most of the profits that come from developing those oil reserves have gone into that future fund, not in the hands of private investors, although private investors get a small return for their efforts. In Australia, it's the opposite way around. We get almost no return for the gas, the oil, the uranium, the coal, the gold, the bauxite, the diamonds, the rare earths that are mined in this country. We are basically nothing more than an open cut mine where people come and take what they want and leave us a large hole at the end of their enterprise to fill.